Hello everyone, welcome to this NPTEL course on feminist writings by Dr. Abhishek Parri. I am Shikriti Shannal.
And I'm Mohit Sharma. We are research scholars from the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences. And today we'll be discussing the two poems in the course, which is
The Goblin Market and
by,
Tulips.
Yeah, and Tulips by Sylvia Plath. And we'll discuss some themes and how the poems explore the female experience. And because they're both written in different centuries, so we'll see how these experiences have shifted and evolved over the years, and how the concerns are different in 20th century.
Yes, as in 19th century and 20th century. Yeah. So these poems have already been dealt with by Sir, and we are going to just go over the themes and some of the key concepts as Mohit suggested. Okay, so beginning with the Shall we begin with the Goblin Market then? So talking about the Goblin Market is written by Christina Rossetti in 1859, and so which tells us that it's the 19th century and the Victorian period.
Victorian.
Right.
This is a poem of two sisters, Laura and Lizzie, who are tempted by fruits by goblin merchantmen. This poem can be read as a fable, but it also deals with lots of issues concerning gender, sexuality, desire, and consumerism and capitalism, which was becoming more and more dominant in the 19th century.
Right. So I think before jumping into the poem, it's important to understand the context of it, like the 19th century setting. So we can see how industrialization is slowly starting, and so we get this dichotomy between the rural and the urban, right, during that time. And we also see, when we talk about this poem as a feminist poem, so I think we could talk a little about the condition of women during that time. In the 19th century, which was mostly that they were homebound. They obviously were not supposed to have an aspiration or have a career outside. So they were thoroughly domesticated, restricted to the domestic spaces, and
the only avenue available to them outside of home was not in any kind of agency, but they were sometimes prostitutes, or they were
yes. So the women were divided into, we could say, two, like as Virginia Woolf says, the angel of the house, and as well versus the prostitute, who is an outcast, who is an outsider. So this poem also talks about, in a way we could say there is a binary between the two sisters, because Laura falls into that
the fallen woman
temptation.
And the pristine woman.
Right. So fallen woman here, we could definitely say that Laura is here the fallen woman, because she falls into the temptation of the goblins and their fruits, and she engages with them and comes back with a loss, with a lack, that she does not, she's not able to, she's just basically withering away with time. And whereas Lizzie engages with men, with the goblins, in a very different manner, with definitely with agency, with transaction of money, and then and she returns, and she's not only able to bring that agency to herself, but she can also transfer it to her sister in a way that she is also recuperating from the situation.
And this combines the issue of sexuality, desire, and female agency with the issues of capitalism, consumerism, and the market economy, which is invading the rural space as well, which was supposedly the pure spaces of the Western world, because the urbanization had already consumed the cityscapes.
So they had, and again we can draw a
binary
emerges repeatedly. So between the home and the market, the rural and the urban,
and the familiar and the unfamiliar.
Unfamiliar. So the as we can say, the defamiliarization of the home space, the home economy,
and the predominant theme which links all of these binaries is the question of consumption, and whether the consumption is inspired by greed, if it is reckless, and what are the consequences of reckless consumption.
It can show us the effects of capitalism, because capitalism, again, advertising is a big part of capitalism, how it lures us to different products, whether the need for the product develops only because the product already exists, because it due to advertising and marketing, that need is created. So even in this poem we can see that the goblins, they cry, they shout, they call day and night, morning and afternoon, so there is no escape. And so both the sisters are affected by it, but Lizzie can handle it in a different way. Even when she wants to respond to it, she can hide her response, because she knows that it is not something that we want. not something that is not conventional, not
something which will have consequences, which is tempting, but it's tempting with the evil behind
it. So with Jenny as an example, right? But
we can see in the beginning, like the beginning sets the tone of the poem. The first stanza, the long stanza, is a list of products, the fruits, the rich, luscious fruits that the goblins advertise to the people of that rural area, and they roam around the glen and the dales, and they advertise all kinds of. There's a long list of fruits which they.
I think it's interesting that the poem mentions that the sisters, they make their own produce.
Yeah.
Right, so they have a very independent economy. They don't depend on the outside market or the outside world. So they are very codependent and very cocooned in their own beautiful, blissful,
self-sufficient rural economy,
right?
which is being invaded by this market economy of capitalism, which seeks to control it and which seeks to make it dependent on
the capitalist mode. Exactly. Right. The structure of capitalism.
So we see how like with the arrival of goblin merchantmen, first of all, it's very interesting how they are described. Like they are goblin merchantmen.
Yes.
And so there's a masculine aspect to it. There's an animalistic aspect to it in the way they are described by as having different animal countenances, which is sort of like there's a greed attached to it. There's a wolfishness attached to it.
And along with the greed, we can say that the poem has a lot of sexual metaphors also. So when you read the sections and how they are alluring you, so a feminist reading of the text can simultaneously tell us that the goblins and the goblin market could also mean the male sexual temptation, right? Or the perversion, right? So which is also a way of looking at it. So
which allures the female into the state of fallenness.
Right.
Which the resonances of which we see in the story of Jenny later on, and we also see in the life of Christina Rossetti, from which she was inspired as her work.
She was a social worker, a volunteer at
St. Mary Magdalene's House of Charity, in which
where they believe that it's possible to redeem the fallen women of the time. So I think the fallen woman, the idea of the fallen woman is very interesting in the Victorian period, because she was really, there was a category of fallen woman who was again juxtaposed with the angel of the house. And the fate of the fallen woman was always bad, negative, and there was no hope that she could get back to her life, because she was a social outcast and she was not permitted into the social circles at all. So, but with this kind of portrayal of fallenness by Christina Rossetti, I think she brings a different angle to it, and she, in the end, gives us some hope, or the character some hope to redeem herself.
And the idea of sexual, the state of fallenness in sexuality is also juxtaposed against the idea of giving into the consumer consumption, desire of consumption.
So we can say that the very idea of fallenness itself is questioned by Rossetti, because in Victorian culture in the 19th century they were very strict about their moral codes and conducts, right? So any deviance from the morality, or as we call it, the Victorian morality, we still use the term. So any sort of deviation would eventually introduce you to the category of fallenness. But here, the way she is represented,
this idea is presented along with the idea of consumption and the state of having fallen into reckless consumption, which gives us the picture of the Victorian state at that time, where consumption and capitalist reckless consumption was also
any consumption was sin, and it was considered to be a sin.
It was considered to be a sin.
So the consumption here, we can see the consumption in two ways. We can see it as a sexual consumption. We can also see it as a economic, the consumption of products, an economic consumption. But whatever
transgression.
Transgression, and whatever way we interpret it, it's equally sinful and equally fallen. And the predicament for a woman in the 19th century would be the same.
I think here we can introduce the idea of Jenny, which embodies that idea of fallen, of the fallen woman.
Right. And so the stereotypical fallen woman, and what fate awaits her.
Right. So there are two critical moments in the poem in which Lizzie warns Laura about the dangers of falling into this desire, the temptation of consumption with abandon. And she gives the example of Jenny, who was supposed to have gotten married, and which is the state of the proper Christian consummation of marital love. But instead she fell into the temptation of the fruits which were given by the goblin merchant men, and then she pined away, and then she withered, and then she died. So that serves as a warning to Laura and to the readers as such, that the idea of consumption can devour you as such, like you become the consumed instead of the consumer.
And but in the end, it is interesting to note that what saved Laura was ultimately Lizzie's love. And her protectiveness and her agency that saved Laura out of a situation. And so there we can say that in this poem, Christina Rossetti actually introduces these two female characters very differently and very independent, in a very independent fashion, because it was not common in the Victorian society for two women to live alone, two unmarried women without a family. So they were shown as like two very independent women, and even throughout the encounter with the goblins and how different the two sisters reacted to it differently, and it shows us the different shades of femininity and female desire, how desire or how women are not passive recipients of sexual desire. They also can participate in or engage in sexuality.
There is a solidarity of like females there.
So sisterhood and solidarity of women,
and it is put against the onslaught of the like masculine economy,
and patriarchy, of course.
And we see that like there's no other male character. It's like they fend for themselves. They not only protect their surroundings, but the economy that they represent, the rural economy that they represent.
And in that way, they are not dependent on any other man to fend for them.
We see different verses where they get up and they do the daily work, they churn the butter and they get the milk.
And even towards the end, when they are Rossetti tells us that they are settled and they are married, their husbands know where
telling their children's stories.
They are telling the children's stories, and even then we don't see any male figure actually intervene. So we can say that this is definitely a feminist poem because of its representation of femininity and its addressing of issues like female sexuality, female desire, and also issues of consumption and capitalism and economy and market. And I think it's interesting when we are talking about the bond between the sisters and how one saves the other. Do you think that there is a connotation of, and it's always said that there is a connotation of homoeroticism in the poem?
Definitely, especially in the stanza that we see that they are sleeping together. There's a sort of uncanny vibe in the air in which they are the only ones who are there to protect each other. So the idea of homoeroticism, I think, also comes from the fact that Lizzie has the agency to protect Laura. So it already subverts the stereotypical female images of the helpless woman.
The damsel in distress. You actually don't need a prince to come and save her, like her sister. So the themes of homoeroticism or lesbian love in this poem, I think, has more to do with the solidarity between the sisters and how we could say that both of them are mirrored images of each other.
And how by getting away with the heteronormativity, they actually rest the agency in their own hands and doing away with the idea of having a male rescuer altogether. They do
away with the idea of the male
They are
rescuer.
the fallen woman, but they also save themselves.
So
another interesting aspect which we encounter in this poem is that the goblins are described in a very non-Western, exotic,
Oriental.
The metaphor is very Oriental. In the sense, there's a common refrain whenever they talk about what kinds of things that goblins sell. So the common refrain is men sell not such in any town. So the idea is that the things that they're bringing are produced in faraway places. And then it says where sun shines and on at all hours. So these are exotic products brought on by exotic men who are goblins and having animal countenances. So there's an invasion of the Western household as well.
Yes. So it shows the other, the self and the other. So here the other is invading the space of the Western home and the self-contained space of the women.
So some of the binaries are being
subverted, and because when we talk about perpetuated as well as subverted in ways, because when we talk about women, women themselves are other to men.
Yeah.
So
we have the center stage in the local sphere, but at the same time the purity of the local economy is being threatened by the exotic other who are bringing things which are tasty, which are delicious,
which are very tempting.
Yeah, but which has an addicting quality to it, which is what Lizzie warns Laura against, and which is what Jeannie almost dies of.
So basically the poem again coming back to it, or probably repeating the same thing, that the idea of consumption and production and consumption and advertising and temptation, so all these are very important themes. So how the capitalist market lures us into buying products which then we feel the need of the products, and the way they are advertised, and the goblins, how they mention all the different fruits, and you almost feel tempted to go and taste it.
And interestingly, it is relevant even now. The concerns that were presented in this poem, and that almost 1.5 century earlier, are still relevant in the way that how advertising lures us into reckless consumption, how that reckless consumption ends up consuming ourselves. And how we need to take an agency.
But I think in a way that so between the two sisters, it is also shown how they consume differently. How Lizzie and Laura, because when Laura consumes, she is completely helpless and she does not have any agency at all. She's just an object in the hands of the capitalist, if we can say it, call them capitalist goblins. So, but then when we see that when Lizzie interacts with them or engages with them, she makes a transaction, she pays with a penny. So that penny is very important here, because being a woman, again, being a woman, and being a consumer and being a woman, she can enter that male space, that patriarchal space of capitalism, and come out as a winner.
She's the principled consumer, who's consuming with the idea of a transaction rather than something
for her own pleasure.
For her own pleasure, something being given without any exchange happening. So when an exchange happens, when you transact with money, you take control of the transaction that you are entering into.
When with Laura, the transaction was with a lock of hair, which means that she's giving something personal of her, and so
which ends up becoming much
more, because she comes back with a loss, personal loss. Right. But for Lizzie, it is more of an economic transaction, that she has also entered that space.
And when she gives that penny, we see that it is at that moment that the power of the goblin start disintegrating.
Yes, so power shifts clearly from the goblins to Laura.
And then they attack her.
Sorry, to Lizzie.
Yeah, and when they attack her, and we see a long description of how in different ways they attack her, they maul her, they scratch her, and in that very visceral scene of violence being inflicted upon Lizzie.
In fact, we could say that sexual violence.
Yeah, it is almost like a sexual violence which is being perpetrated on someone who is maintaining the integrity, and maintaining the integrity of the transaction as well. So here we see capitalist consuming tendency,
or what we can call probably as a consumer agency. Right, so because when consumers are not just passive recipients, because they can also exhibit some agency, if we see in the case that Lizzie does, like, because she is the owner, because she can pay with the transactable amount and with the money. So she has some agency in how she comes out of the situation of sexual violence or luring of capitalism, and how she can overcome all of that and also transcend that success or that agency to her sister and save her in the end.
So that it makes up a front against the collusive forces of consumer greed, as well as heteronormative hegemony that is being imposed on a woman.
Yeah, by patriarchal society.
Which was all the more obvious at that time. Another interesting thing to observe in the poem is that how the invasion by goblins turn the very familiar and domestic space into an unfamiliar space. So the invasion defamiliarizes the homely space that is inhabited by Laura and Lizzie.
Yeah.
And we see that in the descriptions, like initially in the beginning of the poem, the places that they visit to collect food and to gather berries. It is described in a very, very pristine and very.
So there's a certain holiness attached to it. Yes.
It's the typical
purity, the idea of the pure and which is contrasted with the impurity of the goblins.
Right. And when Laura has been addicted to the fruits given by the goblin men, and we see her pining away, and Lizzie is concerned about her sister, then it is from that point onwards we start to see the defamiliarization happening in the homely scene, and we encounter lines like,
can we probably read a section from the poem itself?
Yeah, I'll just read a section. We see like moons and stars gazed in at them, wind sang to them lullaby, lumbering owls forbore to fly, not a bat flapped to and fro round their rest, cheek to cheek and breast to breast locked together in one nest. So we see that in a very homely space where the sisters are sleeping, and we are seeing the metaphors of bats and owls.
Right.
So an uncanny atmosphere start to set in.
Exactly. So that is the pretext of what is going to happen later on.
And the glens and the dales that they used to visit are now being haunted by goblin men, which again have made them a place which one should avoid visiting.
Right. Now, this reminds me of a very interesting thing that when Christina Rossetti, if you read the poem, it's a long narrative, and it has a fable-like structure, and it has rhymes and rhythms. So it's almost like a children's poetry, right? So, but I think that it is
emotive in that
sense. But I think writing in the 19th century, addressing issues like female desire, sexuality, sexual violence, and even capitalism, so all these issues, being a woman writer in the 19th century would have been very difficult for Christina Rossetti to address, the poet to address directly. So she used this form of a fable, of a story, so that she can talk about these issues in disguise, not very apparently, not on the face, for which she would have probably faced very harsh criticism, and maybe not allowed to publish it at all. So
and the concerns and the threat which is inherent in the system is being shown in the kind of defamiliarization, and
again there's
ominous atmosphere which is starting to set in. We see that inherent threat in the setting of the scene, which gets worse and worse until Lizzie decides to take action, which she does with going to the goblins and paying with the penny what she wants. And because she pays with the penny, the fruits that the juices that Laura consumes from Lizzie's body actually ends up curing her. So that's very interesting to see, that it's the idea of the principled consumption that saves you, and the unprincipled consumption that actually devours you.
Okay, so moving on to the next poem that we are going to discuss today, Tulips by Sylvia Plath.
And in this poem we see the narrator is recuperating in a hospital, and it's a very, very, very personal poem.
It's a very personal poem, even confessional in mode.
It's almost an inward account of how the female self is getting disintegrated in the poem. It's a very, very intense poem, and it chronicles the disintegration of the self seen through the eye, a female self.
And we can also see in this poem, it deals with depression, it deals with loss, because as Sylvia Plath has had a miscarriage while she was writing it, before writing it, and she was in a similar hospital setting. So it critiques the medical institution, and it talks about the medical gaze.
And it talks about how the medical gaze and being almost sort of imprisoned in a medical institution sort of strips you of agency, a very coherent idea of selfhood, and
of his subjectivity, because from being a subject we can see that in this poem how the poet is turned into an object, and she is stripped of her all of her subjectivity, and she just becomes a set of numbers and a coalition of her body parts. Right?
Yeah, which is being administered in a very objective and a very impersonal way by a long line of nurses
and doctors. Again, even these people are not really subjects, because the poet cannot see them as human beings. They are merely one body replaced by another body. So you cannot distinguish between. So there is no human empathy. There is no human touch. Right. So everything is about this mechanism that's operating in a hospital setting.
And I think it is in this central question that the whole problem of the medical institutionalization which Plath deals with lies, that the doctors and the people of that institution, they treat you as a body while you treat yourself as a self, and the conflict between the two of these approaches is irreconcilable. That we see that the narrator is exploring her own self, which is not necessarily corporeal. And while at the same time she's being treated, she's being dealt with, and she's being dealt with in a very impersonal and objective manner as a body by those who are supposed to treat her.
And in a way that it makes her feel that her body has become a burden to her, and she wants to get rid of it. Right? And she wants to. Okay, we can come back to that probably later. Would you like to read a section from this?
Yeah. So the poem starts with a narrator telling how she feels in the hospital ward that she's put in.
Right.
And we see that the descriptions are very stripped down, and they indicate a slow move away from the body corporeality, and it's kind of a defamiliarization taking place in the medical institution, where you are getting more and more detached from your body and your selfhood as well.
And we can see that how in the hospital setting everything is white. Right, so obviously it stands for the pristine quality, but it also stands for death, and that spectral quality is there, and which is very boldly contrasted with the redness of the tulips, again, which reminds.
We'll come back to the tulips.
Yeah, we'll come back to the tulips and the symbolism later.
Like so, we see that in the first stanza she says, "As the light lies on these white walls, this bed, these hands." So the hands are these hands. It's not my hands.
Right.
And I am nobody. I have nothing to do with explosions. So we already see a defamiliarization taking place, and
from the very beginning of
the very beginning, that she as a consciousness is separating from her own body, and she's observing her own body as if one of the paraphernalia of the things around her.
Right.
And then later on we see that she takes note of all the stuff around her and what is being done to her as she's being propped
as
up.
If she is just an observer.
Yeah.
She's one of the other observers that are objectifying her body and observing her. So we can look at the different modes of surveillance here. How through the machineries of the equipments of the medical institution, and how they not only
nourish you, they also control you.
They control you
because you are controlled by the machines which keep you alive. They are controlled by the machines which keep your body in a certain,
monitor you constantly,
which keep you in a certain state, and your movement and your agency is restricted.
Everything is restricted
in a hospital.
In a hospital setting. Yeah. So it's also I think reminds us of what Michel Foucault says in Discipline and Punish, and how that the body is under constant surveillance of the state. And the objective is to control the body, turn it into a docile body, so that the maximum output can be brought out of it. So that there is no scope for deviance, there is no scope for abnormality in it. So you get make the body function to its utmost capacity. So therefore we need the constant surveillance, and what Foucault calls as a panopticon.
Yeah, he gives examples of prisons and mental institutions, mental asylums and hospitals, and he shows us how all of these institutions are operating under the same ideas of surveillance and controlling the body, controlling the movement, controlling
right,
the
because
agency.
all these spaces are actually inhabited by people who are deviant in the first place.
Yeah.
So if you see prisoners or
the idea
mentally
of
ill people,
the idea of deviancy is being constructed in these places.
In these places.
Yeah.
So anything that
which is again a
does
question
not,
that we see Plath dealing with in her larger body of work as well.
right, exactly.
Even in the later stanzas, we see that she talks about her body in more and more detached terms. Like, my body is a pebble to them; they tend it as water, and not just the body, the defamiliarization and the decorporalization.
And the comparison with a pebble means that the body is almost become inanimate.
Yeah.
It is not even a living, breathing human body. It has become an inanimate object.
And this detachment extends across the body to other accompaniments,
right.
Relationships and your stuff. And she talks about my patent leather overnight case, I'm sick of baggage, and my husband and child smiling out of the family photo. So even though it's still my husband and child, it is still they are smiling out of a family photo.
But they are not near her.
Yeah,
she cannot feel their presence at all.
And the distancing has taken place. And all of this combines in the next stanza, which starts, I have let things slip, a 30-year-old cargo boat, stubbornly hanging onto my name and address. They have swapped me clear of my loving associations, scared and bare on the green plastic pillow trolley. I watched my tea set, my bureaus of linen, my books sink out of sight, and the water went over my head. And there's an interesting line, I am a nun now, I have never been so pure. So we see this is the culmination of all the de-embodiment which is happening all over these lines.
Right. So she is stripped of her individuality. She is stripped of her subjectivity of any agency that she can have over herself, and she can see there is this distancing between her and the material world. So she, within the medical institution, she is turned into an object who has no idea of selfhood or no idea of subjectivity, and who would just lie there performing how the medical institution wants her to perform or act. So she would be performing that lifestyle and totally detached from her family life and any personal life. So everything that she had or she loved or she owned, she can see them drifting away slowly.
The subjectivity also responds to this by stripping itself of everything which it cannot know, which it can no longer connect to. And that's why in the last line we see that the idea of death and the idea of purity are being they are clubbed together.
Right.
They are
but I think this the idea of purity or pure that she says that I feel I am a nun now, I have never been so pure. So I think this idea of purity is also in a way ironic, because I don't think she really means that she feels pure from inside. So what she means is that
death is the only pure thing left.
So everything is taken away from her. So she's like the tabula rasa. There's this blank space and nothing else. She doesn't even own her body. She doesn't have ownership of her activities of her body or any control over anything anymore. So she feels just like probably a newborn child or a blank space. So that is why what she means by pure, and in a very ironic way.
Which shows us the extent to which the institutions which are repressive and hegemonic and ideological in their own ways, how much agency and subjectivity they can actually strip away from you.
Right. And this is very interesting if you juxtapose this to the idea of consent, because when you go to a space like a medical institution, you voluntarily subject yourself to the treatment, right? So there is no coercion in the place. So that is why it is more of a ISA than RSA, because there is not much coercion happening and you voluntarily submit yourself to it, but it has the capacity through its constant surveillance and oppression, medical oppression through examination and oppression. It has complete autonomy over you, and
you are basically, as an individual, you are giving yourself over to the collective system that is a part of society.
Right.
Your individual autonomy is being obliterated.
So you just become a bed number or a certain patient with this case. You become a case study. Right. So it's very interesting say in a mental institution setting where they keep records of patients and where they maintain a very valid case study. So if you as a patient go back to those to the institution and ask for your case study, and so there was this very interesting book that I was reading. It's called Wasted. So the patient goes back to the hospital to access her records and they cannot find it. So they say that she does not exist, just because she is not in the records, as if her own subjecthood is obliterated from the face of the earth.
The system kind of strips your subjecthood of any any agency and any unique characteristic that you have. It turns it into a commodity which it can manage into its own system.
Or you become from a human being to a set of symptoms, a set of symptoms, and you become a problem.
And set of characteristics. You are defined by certain numbers and names and like figures which are then used to keep track of you.
Right. And even in the say binary between health and illness is always seen. It is not
it's
the
deviancy,
right? So illness itself is a deviancy, something that needs curing, something that needs curing, and you cannot cure yourself. So you hand over your body and your entire selfhood to say experts, quote unquote experts, who are supposed to know everything about curing us, and therefore in the guise of curing the illness, they are actually engaging in their full autonomy over ourselves. And or in this case over Plath.
I think this is a very good point where to talk about mental health as well, because that's also a theme which pervades Plath's work, and it is also something which is associated with this poem, and we see that it's the treatment of disease as a deviancy, which also extends to the idea of question of mental health and what mental illness constitutes of.
Because
and
if
how
you
it is
see
defined.
And if you see categories like hysteria or depression, they are primarily understood as feminine illnesses. So illness itself is feminized in a way, and when you talk about these certain category like hysteria was supposed to be understood as a illness that was came out of the womb. So only women have wombs, right?
Womb.
So the wandering womb. So
and oftentimes the illness that is characterized as feminine is something which has been caused by the systems of oppression that have oppressed females for a long time, which causes a lot of physical as well as mental damage. And once the disease is identified, then it is associated with the female body, female biology, and then that becomes a secondary mode of oppression. In which
very true. That there's this, in a way we see there's this pathologization of femininity itself. Like if you have too much of femininity, being a woman, if you are too female, then you are called a hysteric. And if you are masculine, say if you are a masculine woman, even then that is a deviance, right? So there is always this need to be the perfectly masculine man or the perfectly feminine woman, or any deviance from it is pathologized and then obviously medicalized.
And both the body and the mind of and both the female body and the female mind is pathologized, like you said, that it's an impure body, and the mind also is like imbued with hysterical tendencies.
Of course, because a woman's body has more complicated hormonal functions, or that is what medical science tells us, and it is a way that it makes it more vulnerable to this kind of examination and scrutiny, because women are supposed to have weaker bodies and weaker minds, and whatever is weak can be violated more easily. So that is the trope that the medical sciences or the mental health institutions use, controlling.
And more control is sought after them. They are sought to be controlled more.
Just like the prisoners that Foucault talks about in Discipline and Punishment.
And here there's a very interesting comparison with the short novella, The Yellow Wallpaper, written by Charlotte Perkins Gilman.
So even in Gilman's story, how we see, so it's very interesting that even Gilman later writes in a letter that she was administered the rest cure, what is called the rest cure, so that when she was undergoing her pregnancy, and so for women, for especially for middle class or upper class women during the 19th century Victorian times, they were administered what is called the rest cure.
And the confinement.
So which means that complete confinement for over a period to 3 to 6 months and regulated diet. And what is most interesting to observe is that they were supposed to disengage from all sorts of physical activity. So you are supposed to only rest.
Basically household imprisonment.
Household imprisonment, and in a way that they, Perkins Gilman was almost, she was not even allowed to write. So which became the primary problem for her. She used to hide her stuff, and to express herself she had to write, and she was not even allowed that much of mental exercise. So it is in a way returning the woman to that infantile state.
Yeah,
that
woman is infantilized.
Yes. So that infantilization is, we could say, is predominant even in forms of treatment that are offered during the time.
And in Yellow Wallpaper, we see how the confinement and the total infantilization of woman actually leads to the disintegration of
her mental
mind,
health,
her subjectivity, her mental health.
Right.
Which draws lots of parallels
with this poem, because just like Plath here is in a hospital setting, Gilman's was confined in a room, and just like for Plath it is the tulips, and for Gilman's it is the yellow wallpaper.
Let's come to tulips.
Yeah, and how it is, tulips is just not a bunch of flowers, but how it is, it is like a set of metaphors and symbols, and it's also personified. Lots of things are being done here.
And the tone is set in the first line, where it writes, "The tulip are too excitable. It is winter here." And then we see how like she's confined in the hospital room. It is all white, and she's being stripped away of her agency bit by bit, and she gets defamiliarized from her body.
So the whiteness of the hospital and the redness of the tulips.
The bright violet red. And then we see how it's interesting to see how the tulips being introduced in her room is like an anchor which keeps her tied to the material reality which she's drifting away from.
Yes.
And that also becomes it also becomes a violent gesture.
Yes, and you could also say that the tulips symbolize the trauma that she is currently going through, the trauma of the child loss, and the trauma, the wound, as if that raw fleshy wound is present in front of her, and she is not even allowed to forget it. Even if she wants to, she cannot escape that truth anymore.
Yeah, it says, like the narrator says that their redness talks to my wound, it corresponds. So the wound, that the bodily wound, the wound of miscarriage is being reflected back in, and is being amplified in the redness of the tulips. Which presents such a stark contrast to the whiteness of the wound.
So can we also say that these tulips then stand for say a very microcosmic representation of the society, how the world works, because here is she lying in a hospital bed and stripped of all her subjectivity, and there the tulips are there as a reminder, as a symbol of the worldly expectations and the societal structures, and still where the dichotomy of power exists.
And like the tulips represent the whole hospital space is very it strips you away of your subjectivity and everything. And then tulip act as a disruptive physical presence, which like in the last stanza, she's drifting away. She says, "I am a nun now. I have never been so pure." And then tulips enter, and then tulips kind of anchor her subjectivity out, away from the decorporalization that she's experiencing, and back into the restrictive and the restraining physical reality that she's bound to. And so
we could say that say flowers are supposed to mean a comforting presence, but in this poem it's completely opposed, and that Plath brings us in a way that the flowers represent, what the tulips represent to her is something that is not makes her completely uncomfortable. Not only uncomfortable, that triggers a sort of mental illness in her, where her depression is amplified and where she becomes more suicidal, because it is a constant reminder of her loss. And it is a constant reminder of that pain that she is undergoing, which is again made more and more worse due to in the hospital setting.
In the words that she describes, the mental violence inflicted by the mere presence of tulips is it is written in very expressive words. Like it says that the tulips are too red in the first place; they hurt me. And then in the next stanza, in the last line, it says, "The vivid tulips eat my oxygen." Yes. So it's almost a towering, dominating, and suffocating presence in the room,
right?
Which
does not even allow her to live and breathe.
Yeah, which threatens to completely overrun her subjectivity. Completely.
Yes, completely.
We'll just take a look at the last paragraph,
yes.
Last stanza, and we'll see like the images that she's talking about and how, like what this suffocation and the defamiliarization leads to.
Right.
And Plath writes that the walls also seem to be warming themselves. The tulips should be behind bars like dangerous animals. So we already see a very strong comparison going on. They're opening like the mouth of some great African cat, and I'm aware of my heart. It opens and closes. Its bowl of red blooms out of sheer love of me. The water I taste is warm and salt like the sea, and comes away from a country far away as health. So the last two lines are very interesting, where she writes, comes from a country far away as health. So health is very clearly something very alien to her now.
Yes, a very distant space.
Very distant idea.
Yeah.
Both physically and mentally.
Mentally, yes. And what it does is very interestingly the hospital setting, that instead of curing her body, it in fact even further disrupts her mind to a place that she no longer knows who she is. She no longer knows what health is or what a healthy life represents. And she feels like she's stuck in this.
It makes you a stranger in your own body.
And she feels like she's stuck in this present with that violent, dangerous, in fact, tulip staring at her. So between the window and the tulip. Right. So she's stuck between the world and the presence of
that's the very strong,
tulip.
Imagery there.
Yes, and between.
She's almost like she's flattened out.
Right.
Her physical presence is being completely dominated by the two gaze that that is focused on her from the reality of the outer world, which is by the window, and the reality of the hospital space that she's confined
inside.
In.
So there is the overall patriarchal or societal gaze that is as she as a woman
societal
is constantly facing.
Patriarchal.
And there is also the medical gaze that she as a patient is facing, and so and underneath all these different surveillances, different modes of surveillance, her individuality is completely annihilated towards the end of the poem.
Yeah, and we see that the strangeness and the danger, both of them are combined in a very nice nice analogy that she makes when she says that they're opening like the mouth of some great African cat. So we don't she doesn't say lion or tiger or some other cheetah or leopard, but it says some great African cat. So it's already something strange and something threatening, which is coming, and you don't even know what it is, but it will engulf you. And then another association that I feel is in the last line, that when she says the water I taste is warm and salt like the sea. So warm and salt can refer to water, the sea water. It can also refer to blood. And it can also refer to tears. So this is a very interesting thing, that in these two lines she's combining all the effects of that
that pain, the trauma,
the pain,
everything
the trauma,
comes together,
and the alienation that she's made to feel. In something, it creates something which is as far away as possible from the ideal condition called health.
So so there is again this juxtaposition between what is supposed to be understood as health and what is illness, and
you're supposed to regain your health in a hospital setting.
Right?
But
which is
doing the opposite.
Or just the opposite for at least for Plath. It just that's just the opposite.
At least this is something which is always which is a possibility always present, that the mental, the setting, the ideological apparatus, that is societal apparatus, that is the mental health institution. It strips away of your subjectivity, which is always an effect on the mental conception of the self.
Right. So we see that so in this poem we can totally understand that medical science or the institution of medicine does not incorporate any humanity or empathy, compassion, and these kind of characteristics. It is based on rationality. It is based on scientific, like based on science. And
the impersonality and the ruthlessness of the objectivity that they profess to be implementing
is something as a positivist outlook.
It is something that actually strips you away of your humanity, strips you away of your subjectivity, and
so there is no scope for all these in a within that gaze, within the medical gaze that succumbs you.
And the idea of looking at you as a number, as a data figure, actually alienates you as an individual from the society.
Right, and you can see a complete disembodiment that is happening here. That she is again stripped away of all her physical traits, and even her own body appears to her as a stranger.
So much so that she actually desires to just drift away from all of that.
Drift away from lose her body. So because it has become already a burden for her.
So interestingly, this is the opposite of what we saw in the goblin market.
Right.
In the goblin market, it is the overabundance of desire which is the problem.
Right.
On the other hand, in this it is the stripping away of desire, because the repressive setting is designed to control you by stripping you away of the desire, stripping you away of your agency.
Right.
On the other hand, in goblin market, it was the fraudulent prospect of giving you some agency which will actually make you addict or into somebody who is who cannot control the consumption that he or she wants to engage in.
Yeah. So and also interestingly that we could say that in goblin market that the two sisters could act as a double of each other, and in the end they clearly one sister complement each other, and in the end one sister ends up saving the other. But here we see that in this poem Plath is completely alone, and she does not have any ally. Like even her family is only now become photographs, and they are not physically present here, so they have no idea what she's going through. And you can see that Lizzie has constantly been supportive towards Laura. She has always been trying to find a solution to Laura's problem, but here there seems to be nobody, which further extends that disintegration or mental disintegration that Plath would face.
So the another interesting thing further adding to your point is that she makes a lot of references to inanimate objects. The imagery is very inanimate and strange as well.
So the body is constantly compared to inanimate objects. So it's telling us how strange and how again objectified, how it has become an object and not a living, breathing subject.
Right. It's a cut paper shadow.
Cut paper shadow.
Or it is something strange, or even the evil presence is something strange, like some great African cat. So like we see how this poem represents a consciousness struggling against the repressive apparatus of society, which points its gaze upon you and like deprives you of all your authority.
Right. So this poem can be said to be a critique of the Institute of Medicine. It is a critique definitely of patriarchy, and and it actually shows how any institution, be it educational institution, medical institution, religious institution, everything is organized as a patriarchal structure, and which, being a woman in both the poems, like where we could see that how capitalism is patriarchal in structure. Right. In this poem we see how the medical institution itself is patriarchal in structure, where it operates through modes of constant surveillance, examination, and control of the physical body as well as the mental conditions, and where the human beings are reduced to just mere objects of study.
Yeah. And we see in both the poems, we see how societal forces, be it economic forces in Goblin Market, or state forces or biopolitical forces, which turns the subject into an object. It strips you away of your subjectivity. In Goblin Market, it is the threat of the consumer being controlled by the market, while on the other hand, here we see the subject as a docile patient, which is being controlled by the state authority, the institutional authority of the...
and institutional authority, and in a larger picture, the state authority. Right. So because
as a patient, which is the data point which can be controlled as a body.
Because again, coming back to the point that illness as a deviance, and anything that is divine needs to be controlled so that it does not disrupt the normative structure of society as a whole.
The hegemonic structure should be
maintained. The power structures should not be disrupted. So but then it's we can say that although Goblin Market ends probably on a positive note, that there is at least some agency, certain liberation towards the end. But if we talk about Tulips, it is more depressing in its tone, because there is no scope for agency, there is no scope for liberation or of the power dynamics to be shifting. There are definitely Plath as a poet subverses protocols, and she gives us the confessional mode or her personal impressions on settings. But then even towards the end, escape from the body and escape from life is the only solution that she can probably...
There's no redemption.
There's no
redemption. The Goblin Market.
Right.
And I think this is very topical, because it is indicative of the shift in the understanding of human condition that took place from 19th century
to the 20th century. Right. So when we come from the Victorian age to the modern age, and how identity is furthermore fragmented, it's all the more disrupted. So
and the idea of a universal solution or a universal moral or ethic that you can look forward to, that is undermined.
And that does not exist anymore. So if we can say that Laura and Lizzie can complement each other, and both are like two halves that come together and become a whole. When
there's no such consolation in
there's no such consolation in Tulips, because it is again a post-war World War poem, and it's set in modern times after the war, where there is total fragmentation, disintegration, and there is no possibility of a grand narrative of happiness to succeed.
Or some narrative which you can ascribe to explain away things, or to which you can look forward for some consolation. Be it religious, there's no such religious narrative, or neither a narrative in human agency as well, because we see how the structures pervade, the structures actually control all of your agency, and the power pervades through that structure to deprive you of any kind of resistance that you may think up of putting on.
And the structure of both the poems is also important to look at, that while Christina Rossetti guises all her the points that she wants to make, or all her challenges against authority and patriarchy, she guises it in the guise of a fable, or in the guise of a story or a children's poem. But Plath's tone here is more confessional, it is more direct, it is more personal. So here she does not need to again adopt the disguise of any a story or a fable. I think that also is a commentary on the times and the setting, and the authority of the female writer, or how much she can contribute, or how much is she allowed to write in a society.
Female consciousness is more closely scrutinized and more closely examined in Tulips.
And even for the scope, the authors, the poets here, in this case it's the poet, so the poet's scope for experimentation or writing the personal things, I think in a way is more I wouldn't say appreciated, but it is more allowed in the modern period, because it is still experimental, and so many people or other poets have, or female poets have worked with it. But when Rossetti was writing in 19th century, it was quite an impossibility.
And I think it's also because in Rossetti's times, women were also expected to conform to certain stereotypes, even when they were writers and they had some sort of agency. So even when you're talking about a lot of stuff, and even when you're critiquing the current prevalent forms of sexual practices, or like economic forces which are changing the society around you, even then you're supposed to maintain a certain conventionality of form, and the conventionality of form in the text indicates a conventionality that you're forced to practice in reality as well.
Right. So, but then we see
which
that
is something that she must adhere to even when she's
writing. Yeah. So, but we see that both these two poets, both the female poets, have very different ways of approaching their topic and very different ways of handling their subject. But both are definitely feminist poems,
right.
Which talk about female desire, female sexuality, be it in Goblet Market, and even Tulips talks about desire, but in a very different way. It is more related to loss and trauma and how women are subjectified and subordinated in a setting such as a hospital setting. And but both the poem, they talk about the female body, they talk about women's experiences in different settings, whether it be the economy on the market space or in the medical space where you are. But in both the cases, the women are consumers. In Goblin Market, they are consumers of the products offered by the Goblin, where in the Tulips, the patient is a consumer of the medicine or the medical industry.
And in both the cases, they are presented as passive consumers.
Right.
Like the idea of consumer
having agency.
The status of being a consumer also can be designed to deprive you of agency. And in both the cases, when
we see that happening.
You see that happening.
Yeah.
As a passive consumer of products that is given to you by goblins, is being playing into the hands of the goblins, and at the same time when you are in the hospital, you are the one supposed to be getting nourishment and getting health, your health back. But there also you are a passive consumer. So we see
because in the relationship of doctor and patient, the doctor obviously has more power than the patient, because that is how the system works. And even when we say that we are voluntarily we are giving our consent and voluntarily incorporating ourselves in the hospital space, but definitely there is a discrepancy of power between the doctor and the patient, and the doctor decides the fate of the patient.
The dynamic of the it shows us that the dynamic of consumption is also something which is decided by forces outside of us.
So all those the forces of repression that operate. So, but then again, I would just probably repeating myself that even in the Goblin Market, that there is some agency towards the end that we get to see, and be it through female solidarity, be it through female solidarity, through family, through sisterhood. But here again, but in case of Plath and Tulips, she seems to be terribly alone, and there is no community to support her. There is no possibility for a solidarity. There is no possibility for an understanding between humans,
which is a commentary on the
social conditions of the
times. Yes. So I think on that note we can end.
Yeah, we can end today's lecture. Thank you.
Thank you very much for watching.